By far, one of the largest changes to Vue in version 8 is terrains in the terrain editor. Some of the workflow related to working with terrains, and a lot of new enhancements for manipulating them. I'm going to start by adding a procedural terrain to the scene. And I can double click to open up the terrain editor. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the zero edges mode. One thing you'll notice is that the Z scale, or the up and down, is a lot closer to the actual scale within the scene. Rather than it being always a constant height and then manipulating it within the user's interface, it does almost perfectly match, and you'll be able to see that change overall. So that is a nice large improvement. You will notice that, of course, the navigation is different. It's now set up more like a camera viewport. We don't have those scroll bars on the side anymore, so we can now navigate the scene with the right click to rotate around, being more like the rotate around object. And it's using this sphere in the center to be sort of an origin point, rotating around that sphere. If you hold down Shift and right click, you can move around and position your central area and where the camera is going to essentially zoom into. And I'm using a scroll on my mouse to zoom in and out. If we hold down the Control key, right click, it's going to change the focal within the terrain editor. So kind of the focal of the camera that's being used. If you hold down Shift and Control, it's going to move you in and out, which is going to be just like using the scroll. So those are very useful. Keeping in mind that really changing the focal will manipulate the perspective. So you will need to use Control and Shift at the same time in order to really move in and out if you don't want to use the scroll. And a note about the hardware, I'm using a scroll that is completely unlocked. If I push on it, pretty much scrolls forever until I stop it. There's no in-between steps. So that does make it a little bit easier to navigate. It is a little more smooth for the navigation. And that's with the Logitech MX Revolution, which is a really nice mouse. Very helpful in Vue or any 3D application, not just because of the scrolling, also because of all the other buttons available. Makes it a little easier to navigate. If we take a look at the top of the interface, we're going to see some new options. The top view, I do want to note, is not going to be like the old top view. All it does is kind of reset the camera to look down on the terrain. So if you do have any perspective changes, focal length, those aren't really going to go away. So it's still the same camera, it just will change the view. So instead of being locked on that top view, it is still the same camera, just resetting the view to look from above. Some of the other options are to show a shiny specular value on the terrain. There's also a wireframe view. And I'm going to go ahead and just decrease my brush size really quick so it's not obstructing the view. And then we have a clipping range, which will show us clipping planes when we're cutting out the terrain using the max and min values. And there's the ability to paint within those constrained ranges as well, and I'll show you that once we start working with the painting tools. And there's also an option to view the scene, which is going to show scene lighting, placements of your cameras, and also anything else in the scene. So let's go ahead and add something to the scene just to take a look at that really quick. I'm going to throw another terrain, just using a standard terrain. We'll move it out off to the side. And I'm going to throw a bit of an ecosystem on here. just something simple. We'll use maple tree. Go ahead and populate that. Go back into the procedural terrain, edit the object, and we can switch to that view scene mode. And now we're going to see the ecosystem, other objects in the scene, also any ecosystems that are going to show up on the terrain you're editing. And it gives you a really good sense of what you're looking at, what areas of the scene you can work with the terrain. Also, any intersections are shown, allowing you to a lot easier conform to objects or go around them. So there's some really cool features. And I want to note that you can work while viewing the scene. You can do most of the operations, although there may be a few problems when you're working with zones. And some of the other displays are not available. The clipping range, which means painting within the clipping range, not really possible, and then the wireframe view is impossible. So you may have to turn the mode off to perform some of the operations. You'll also notice just the arrangement of the tabs have been slightly changed. Where procedural used to be on the end, now it's the second one. So not really something big, it doesn't change anything. But you will notice a new tab, which is the Zones tab. And we will take a closer look at this a little later and how to work with it. But basically we can view the zones. We can add additional zones. Once we click Add, we can draw out a new area of the terrain we want to work with. And we can switch between zones. And then you can also set up the fading, which we'll take a look at, which will allow you to kind of blend the different zones together. This is really useful for infinite terrains, anything like that. And we're going to take a quick look at infinite terrains now. And this is a change that was made in 7.5. Has been slightly improved since 7.5 and 8. So let's start out by loading in a infinite terrain. Replace the ground. It's going to adjust with the sea in order to adjust the atmosphere. And also the leveling of the terrain itself. Now, the biggest change is really going to be the fact that infinite terrains are now truly infinite, rather than being in a fixed location. I'm going to go ahead and just delete that sea level so we can see this a little bit better. And what I'm talking about is if we select the default terrain, because I just loaded in the default infinite, when we take a look at the scale, what we're going to see is it's 142 kilometers by 142 kilometers. Now in view 7, this would have been a fixed amount, which means the camera could have reached the end of the terrain. Now what has happened is the terrain is now connected to the camera. So as we move the camera, the terrain will move with it. And that way we always have the terrain stretching to the horizon. Before it would have had to been a manual change, or you would have to set up a graph. Another thing that has changed is the scaling is now also connected to the camera. So we now have a slightly larger size. The more we lift up the camera into the atmosphere, the larger the scale of the terrain will become in order to compensate for the distance. There are also the changes with spherical scenes and planetary terrains, which we're going to cover completely in a different section of the training. I do want to note, if you take a look in the main camera view right now, I cannot see the complete scale of the terrain, and this is going to be controlled if we go to File Options, and under Display Options we can see the Opengl Clipping range. What we can do is increase the range to make sure it's just beyond the size of the terrain. So let's just make it 240 kilometers, and then we're going to have that open up. So this becomes even more important with planetary spherical scenes, and we'll look at that, like I was saying, a little bit later. It has its own section. So now we're going to move on and take a look at the sculpting tools and also the material distributions available within the terrain editor, and exactly how they work and how to use them.